I have spent the first 2 weeks of this term creating designs for my THUMBHARP. This started with research and progressed to accurate diagrams created using CorelDRAW. These will be used when laser cutting. This week started by using the laser cutter to cut both the soundboard and veneers out using the designs I had already created. I chose the colours and textures of veneer at this point. I needed to make sure that they would look aesthetically pleasing together in the final product. I chose where I would like to place the veneers using my creative instincts, and then glued them down with an even and thin layer of glue before clamping them ready for next week. This is an important part of your THUMBHARP, and you need to make sure that no mistakes are made at this point. This week, I started by cutting the back of my THUMBHARP out with the scroll saw. With this and my soundboard, I had 2 complete sides. Next, I traced out the shape of my THUMBHARP onto a piece of thick pine, marking the places where I would drill guide holes for the jigsaw. I then drilled these guide holes using a handheld drill before cutting out the entire inner portion of the pine with the jigsaw. This left what would become a large resignation chamber. Next up, I cut out the outer portion of the pine with the bandsaw, leaving me with the body section of my THUMBHARP, complete with a seamless resignation chamber. Lastly, I glued the back, middle and front portions of my THUMBHARP's body together, clamped it up tightly and left it to dry for next week. The aim of this week was to get my THUMBHARP ready for its tines. This started by removing any large amounts of waste from the THUMBHARP with the bandsaw, before using the belt sander and rotary sander to remove any significant waste that remained. Once the larger amounts of waste had been removed, I started to sand the THUMBHARP body by hand, taking extreme care, being careful to always sand with the grain, and making sure I didn't damage the body aesthetically. When my THUMBHARP body was completely sanded with no rough areas or any traces of glue or other residue, I began work on the bridge that would hold my tines. I measured a small segment out of a length of wood that had previously had 2 small gutters cut using the benchtop router, and cut this length to size with the bandsaw. Next, I sanded this length of wood by hand until I had reached the shape I desired, making sure I did not make the bridge so small it could not hold my tine. I then glued this onto my THUMBHARP's body and left it to dry. After my bridge had dried and was firmly in place on my THUMBHARP, I double checked that there were no glue marks before varnishing my THUMBHARP and leaving it to dry. This week started out with cutting the tines to size. Using the bench shears, I cut 8 lengths of brass rod. Next, I flattened out the end of each of these lengths of rod so that they would be easier plucked. I did this using a hammer and anvil. After the tines were cut and flattened out, I rounded off any sharp edges with a file so they would not harm the user. When making your tines, it is important to remember how long you need each tine to be. I started this week by marking and then cutting a length of brass bar that would serve as part of my tine mechanism. I then sanded this off slightly before marking 3 points and using the drill press to drill 3 holes at these points so that I could secure it to the bridge. Next, I cut 2 sections of brass rod that would also be included in the tine mechanism. After I had finished these 3 components, I marked and drilled 3 holes in the bridge with a handheld drill. These would line up with the brass bar. The final step of my THUMBHARP creation was tuning. I placed all 3 components of my tine mechanism on the bridge of my THUMBHARP before using 3 screws to hold down the brass bar. Once I had screwed the screws about halfway in, I began to add my tines. This was a tedious process and was mainly done by ear and eye, although a tuner may be useful to some people. Once I had figured out where all my tines would go, I screwed in the screws as tight as I could. You can also cut excess tine material at this point or choose to do it later. And so, in a semester's worth of planning and a term's worth of work, I've created my very own functioning instrument. Along the way, many mistakes and improvements were made, and my woodworking skills improved immensely. And best of all, I was left with a product I can call my own.